Okay, so today we're going to continue reading in the book of Jeremiah, starting in chapter 34. I don't know how far we're going to get. We've already read, of course, chapters 46 to 51, which are the prophecies to the other nations. Most of the rest of this is going to be a narrative account of the fall of the city and the aftermath. And that will be pretty straightforward and simple compared to what we've already read. Oh boy. Right. I'm not doing this at the usual time of day, of my usual method, so therefore the cats are out and about today. I've worked out a pretty good way of eliminating them as nuisances when I do these videos, but I could not make that happen today because of just various reasons. So they are out and about right now and are very much causing trouble. Let me get this away from you. At least I do not trust you with that. I don't know how far we'll get in this today, because there is still a lot of material to go through, and although a lot of it is going to be pretty straightforward and fast, at least compared to what we've already read, there's still going to be a lot, so I don't know. We have a couple more chapters of just kind of random things. And then we're going to get into the actual account of the fall of the city. So here we go, in Jeremiah 34. While Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army, and all the kingdoms and peoples in his empire, or the empire he ruled, it wasn't just Babylon, it was Babylon and a confederacy of other nations. They had initially joined forces in order to take out Assyria, because everyone hated Assyria so much. And so now they're aligned with Babylon. Eventually, some of these nations are going to align themselves against Babylon. That's going to happen 100 years from now. Or, well, actually less than that at this point, but still. That's just how it goes. That's how history goes. I have a pest of it. You're going to hurt yourself, cat. Yes, you are. You're going to hurt yourself. Don't do that. I have a pest of a cat here. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Right. Okay. So, while Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army, and all the kingdoms and peoples in the empire he ruled, were fighting against Jerusalem and all its surrounding towns, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. So this is in the final siege. We've had a few accounts given of what happened during the final siege. Unfortunately, of course, they're not in order, so we're just kind of skipping back and forth a lot, but this is another account that happened during the final siege. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Go to Zedekiah, king of Judah, and tell him, this is what the Lord says. I am about to hand this city over to the king of Babylon, and he will burn it down. You will not escape from him. You will not escape from his grasp, but you will surely be captured and handed over to him. You will see the king of Babylon with your own eyes. That's the last thing he's ever going to see, as it turns out. And he will speak with you face to face, and you will go to Babylon. You hear the promise of the Lord, O Zedekiah, king of Judah. Yet hear. So that, yet hear the promise of the Lord, O Zedekiah, king of Judah. This is what the Lord says concerning you. You will not die by the sword, so they're not going to put him to death. But you will die peacefully. He's going to be in prison the rest of his life and blind, but he's going to die peacefully. As people made a funeral fire in honor of your fathers, the former kings who preceded you, the good ones, I'm assuming, not necessarily the bad ones, so they will make a fire in your honor and lament, Alas, O Master, I myself make this promise, declares the Lord. Then Jeremiah the prophet told all this to Zedekiah king of Judah in Jerusalem, while the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and the other cities of Judah that were still holding out, Lachish, and Azekah. These are the only fortified cities left in Judah. So they're down to 3. Jerusalem, Lachish, and Azekah. And once they go, they're all going to go. And we actually have some letters that were written around this time to a commanding officer, I believe, stationed in Azekah, or maybe written by him or to him, I'm not sure. They call them the Lachish letters, and they were written on potsherds and sent to an officer in Azekah. I think it's Azekah, or Lachish, excuse me, because that's where they found it. And they say in one of these letters that they can't see the signal fire from the other town. The signal fire has gone out, meaning that town has fallen. So that town fell, and then Lachish would have fallen, and then Jerusalem. Zedekiah, we'll read about him as we go through the next few accounts. He appears to have been a very weak-willed person. Doesn't seem to have been as explicitly or overtly evil as his predecessors, but he seemed to be very weak-willed and unable to stand up to the influences around him. So I think it's probably the reason why his life was spared in the end. I don't know how long he lived in captivity. I don't know. We don't. 50 years. I mean, he was still a young man when he would have been taken prisoner in his mid-30s or so. He could have lived 50 years in captivity. I don't know. I have no idea. But apparently he was kept alive and died in relative peace as a prisoner in Babylon. A blind prisoner, because they put out his eyes. That's not mentioned here as part of this prophecy. That part is being kept secret from Zedekiah, but it is kind of referred to by saying that he'll see the king of Babylon face to face, or he will see him with his own eyes, and it turns out that'll be the last thing he ever sees. The word came, now here's another account. The word came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah, that guy again, the last king of Judah, had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem. Oh my goodness, oh my. To proclaim freedom for the slaves. Everyone was to free his Hebrew slaves, both male and female. No one was to hold a fellow Jew in bondage. So all the officials and people who entered into this covenant agreed that they would free their male and female slaves and no longer hold them in bondage. They agreed and set them free. But afterwards, they changed their minds and took back the slaves they had freed and enslaved them again. Okay, so let's go back a bit here. Way back in Exodus 20. Literally the very first law he gave them after the 10 Commandments is this. Leviticus 20, or not Leviticus, Exodus 21, verse 1. These are the laws the Lord has set before them. So this is, the previous chapter was the 10 Commandments, and then telling them not to worship other gods. So literally the very first law they get after that is this. Exodus 21, verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. Then the 7th year he shall go free, without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears the slave, sons or daughters, the woman and her children belong to the master. Only the husband shall go free. And then it has a provision about someone selling himself to an owner for life if he likes that owner. That was the very first law they received after the 10 Commandments. So freeing their slaves, their fellow Hebrew slaves, was a big deal to God. And he was talking to people who had just come out of slavery at that point in time. I don't know really what the context here is in Jeremiah 34 about this. I doubt they're actually doing this because the law says so. They may be doing it somewhat to try to get God's favor. Apparently they had not been freeing their slaves every 7 years like they're supposed to be. And so they decided to do so at this point in time. Not necessarily because they actually felt compelled to follow the law, obviously because they took the slaves back afterwards. probably because they were trying to curry God's favor and manipulate him into saving the city. Listen to what the Lord had to say about it, though. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I made a covenant with your forefathers when I brought them out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I said, every 7th year, each of you must free any fellow Hebrew who has sold himself to you. After he has served you 6 years, you must let him go free. There's a footnote here citing Deuteronomy 15:12. There's another passage you could go to see that law applied, or see that law given. Your fathers, however, did not listen to me and pay attention to me, so they had not been doing that. They had not been freeing their slaves, their Hebrew slaves. This doesn't apply to foreign slaves they had taken. This only applies to fellow Hebrew slaves. Recently, you repented and did what is right in my sight. Each of you proclaimed freedom to his countrymen. You even made a covenant before me in the house that bears my name. That's as far as you can go. You can't get more serious than that. But now you have turned around and profaned my name. Each of you has taken back the male and female slaves you had set free to go where they wished. You have forced them to become your slaves again. Therefore, this is what the Lord says. You have not obeyed me. You have not proclaimed freedom for your fellow countrymen. So now I proclaim freedom for you, declares the Lord. Freedom to fall by the sword, plague, and famine. I will make you abhorrent to all the kingdoms of the earth. The men who have violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf they cut in two and then walked between its pieces. Remember way back in Genesis 15, when God made that covenant with Abraham, and they did this strange practice of Abraham found these animals and cut them up and divided the parts into two, and laid these parts on either side of a pathway of some kind. And then Abraham went to sleep and had a vision of God as a burning pot and a torch in a pot passing between these pieces. The covenant method that they were, and that was 1500, that was Abraham's day. That was in 1800 BC, 1800 BC. This is 1200 years after that, and they were still doing that. They were still practicing this covenant process of taking animals, cutting them up into parts, setting the parts aside from each other, and then the covenant partners would walk between these parts, and that demonstrates that if one party breaks a covenant, may what was done to these animals be done to that party, the covenant breaker. So apparently, but when they made this covenant to set their slaves free, they did this. We don't really read about that, but we're reading an account of it now, that when they made this covenant to set their slaves free, they did this, they went through this whole process. But then they took their slaves back, which basically means they themselves are saying, may I be cut in two like these animals were. So God says, sure, I'm going to do that to you. I'm going to make you live up to that covenant. The leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the court officials, the priests, and all the people of the land who walked between the pieces of the calf, I will hand over to their enemies who seek their lives. Their dead bodies will become food for the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. I will hand Zedekiah, king of Judah, and his officials over to their enemies who seek their lives, to the army of the king of Babylon, which has withdrawn from you. Okay, so what probably is going on here, during that final siege of Jerusalem, when Babylon came upon Jerusalem that last time, Babylon came on Jerusalem 3 separate times. Once in 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar first became king of Babylon, and he went out to go fight Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish and defeated Egypt, and he marched on Jerusalem afterwards and took a bunch of evil prisoners, including Daniel, which we'll read about when we get to Daniel. And he came back again a few years later in 597 BC, and he took Jehoiakim, the king at the time, out of the picture, and Jehoiachin too, his son, who only reigned for 3 months, took him back to Babylon too, and put Zedekiah in place as king. That was when Ezekiel was captured. That was the second wave of deportations, and Ezekiel was part of that wave. Then they came back again in 588 BC and besieged the city again, and finally got through and destroyed it in 586. But there was a period of time, I'm not really sure when exactly this happened, but somewhere in that final siege, which lasted a year and a half or 2 years or whatever, somewhere in that final siege, there was a moment where the Babylonians withdrew. Because apparently Pharaoh from Egypt had come up to fight them, so they withdrew and went back to go fight Egypt. And then and this is actually very similar to what happened to Assyria 100 years earlier. We read about this in Isaiah. Assyria was encamped around Jerusalem, and they temporarily retreated to go deal with Egypt. And then, apparently, while that was happening, or somewhere around the same time, they had the plague, where the avenging angel destroyed them, and then they went home. So something similar happened here in this day and time, where the army withdrew from Jerusalem, but then came back. And unlike in the days of Hezekiah and Isaiah, there was no miraculous deliverance this time, which I think is probably what Zedekiah was counting on. Zedekiah and his people were probably counting on some sort of miraculous last-minute deliverance, but it was not going to happen. And apparently, now it's not the context, it doesn't say this. The passage doesn't actually say this, but the context seems to indicate it. Apparently, they did the whole thing about freeing their slaves because they thought they're probably trying to manipulate God. They probably thought to themselves, well, we'll show God we're serious about repenting, and maybe He'll deliver us. And then probably the Egyptian army came up. Judah was an ally of Egypt at this point in time. Babylonians withdrew to go fight Egypt, and that probably made the people of Jerusalem feel like they had dodged a bullet, so to speak, and then they took their slaves back. It seems like it. Apparently, it's possible also that when they set their slaves free, I mean, they may have just been thinking, I can't feed this slave anymore. It's like we're in such dire straits, like I can barely even keep myself alive, let alone my slave. I can get rid of my slave and pretend to be pious in doing so. Maybe I can manipulate God into getting rid of these Babylonians. Probably. That was probably all going through their minds. They obviously weren't serious about it, because as soon as they could, they took their slaves back. So obviously they were not serious about it. So the motivations aren't directly given in this passage. So, and because of that, we can't say for sure what was going through their minds. But this seems like the likeliest explanation for why they did all this. At any rate, the Babylonian army had withdrawn from them at this point in time temporarily. But, God says here in verse 22, I am going to give the order, declares the Lord, and I'll bring them back to this city. They will fight against it, take it, and burn it down. And I will lay waste the towns of Judah, so that no one can live there.